Resident Evil 9 latest updates. So I found an article from GameRant.com called Why Resident Evil 9 Could Be Very Different Entry in the Franchise. So I wanted to explore that with you guys since we haven't been able to cover Resident Evil 9 news in a little bit of time. So we're going to cover, basically Resident Evil 9's latest updates from this article. Article is written by Jared Stewart. It's published January 9th. It starts off by saying Resident Evil 9 has many loose threads that it could address as the survival horror franchise continues alongside modern remakes of older titles. The perceived roadmap for the Resident Evil franchise may be obvious, but not necessarily. The franchise is currently working towards remakes and mainline installments, of course, but the IP is an interesting point in development where considerable changes might be made. Resident Evil isn't afraid of shifting its gameplay genre, and it's proven recently it can introduce new and exciting protagonists alongside legacy characters. Resident Evil 9, for example, could be another drastic shift. Resident Evil Village ended with what seems like an obvious sequel tease, and that the tease seems more likely now that it was followed up in a DLC. Instead, Resident Evil Village's Shadows of Rose DLC told a compartmentalized story about Ethan Winter's daughter that probably won't tie into the Resident Evil sequels for a long time. The franchise has many questions about loose threads to address, such as if we will continue to take place in the present day or not. And Resident Evil 9 could be much different installment than many fans expect as a result. Resident Evil 9 will be a turning point because it needs to decide a few things about the franchise's future. Resident Evil will need to select a new protagonist, a reprise of legacy characters such as Chris Redfield, and decide if the game will be played from a first-person or third-person perspective or both. What's more, it will need to decide if horror will continue to be its primary genre. If Resident Evil 9 continues Chris's epilogue thread, then it would technically still be a continuation of the Winters saga. However, it is unlikely that it will feature Mia due to how irrelevant she was throughout the Resident Evil Village and Shadow of Rose DLC. Resident Evil 9 gives Capcom an opportunity to branch out further with the franchise, though its direction would otherwise seem securely situated in newfound horror. It would be fantastic to see if Resident Evil returns to the urban setting like Raccoon City, or if the franchise will be rooted in domestic, remote settings for the time being. Chris Redfield's playable sequence once again turned the franchise over to the action rather than survival horror. Further, it's not uncommon for Resident Evil games to have these sequences where players are meant to be bombarded by enemies with the ammunition they surely reserved throughout. If this sequence is any indication of what gameplay in a sequel could look like, though it may be a hint that an emphasis on action-oriented gameplay is returning, that said, it would be remarkable to see Chris Redfield in Resident Evil that is purely centered around horror with maybe a few more weapons or combat-ready attacks in his arsenal. That could be what the Resident Evil 4 remake is preparing for with Leon Kennedy's new knife parry, and other potential combat strategies that an untrained civilian may not be expected to perform. If Resident Evil 9 attempts to depict another family that the player is unfamiliar with, that could run the risk of having too many similarities to the Winters. Still, there's potential for any new direction as long as Resident Evil's atmosphere and survival horror mechanics are sustained in the meantime. Resident Evil 4 will scratch that itch and allow players to revisit an iconic classic in the franchise. Then it just ends with saying Resident Evil 9 is rumored to be in development. So, taking some of these points that this article basically called out, saying, is Resident Evil going to return to the more survival horror element that, maybe 7 gave us, or the 2 and 3 remakes, or is it going to go more the action-oriented route like we got with that Chris Redfield epilogue in Resident Evil 8, and also, a lot of more of the action-oriented gameplay from Resident Evil 6, or is it going to find that happy medium? For me, I found like Resident Evil 8 had that happy medium, except for obviously that end epilogue. I don't think Resident Evil going to a full action-oriented game is the strategy here. There's a lot of that already out there, a lot of just action-oriented third-person shooters. And I think what Resident Evil thrives on is being that classic horror title that everyone knows and loves. Being an action-oriented game also takes away the horror elements of the game, which I think people love about these games is, that feeling of running out of ammo and being scarce and finding all the resources you need to get through each section of the maps. But this is an interesting take, and I am interested to know what people are kind of aiming for. Like, do people want that more action-oriented title for Resident Evil? Are they wanting, even the harder, what I felt was the harder horror elements, like in Resident Evil 7, where that was just like, the first level was, You barely had one pistol, and you had that demon character chasing you, and you had Mia chasing you around the house. That was just horrifying, and you get to play that in VR too. Like, Resident Evil 7 definitely took the cake for horror. Do you guys want the more action-oriented game, or do you want that happy medium with action and horror elements? For me, I'm down the middle. I want both. I can't just do like a third-person action shooter. We have too many of them, and too much horror kind of drives me away from the game. I'm not the biggest horror movie fan, so if the game's like wicked scary, then I'm probably not going to want to play through it, as it's not my cup of tea. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I'll keep you guys up to date with all the Resident Evil 9 news as it comes in, and we'll keep covering articles when they're, as new things surface. But for now, we'll just kind of wait and see. If you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to smash the thumbs up button. Consider subscribing if you guys want to stay up to date on all the latest gaming news we cover here, as well as just turn on the notification bell so you guys never miss an upload. As always, my name is Ross, and I will see you guys in the next video.